Well, we have with us Bethany Kraft. She's with the Ocean Conservancy, and I'm very eager to hear what you have to say.
Sorry, back to the PowerPoint, but even if I'm not as entertaining as David, at the very least, I'm the last presentation before lunch, so that should count for something. So I'm so happy to be here in Florida. Ocean Conservancy has an office here in St. Petersburg. We've been working in the Gulf of Mexico for the past 2 decades, primarily on fisheries conservation programs, but have really extended our commitment and reach in the Gulf of Mexico in the wake of the Deepwater Horizon and the significant opportunity for comprehensive restoration that vehicles like the Natural Resource Damage Assessment on the impact side, and then of course the RESTORE Act on the broader ecosystem side present to all of us in the Gulf of Mexico. I'm based in our New Orleans office. I grew up in Texas, lived for 10 years in Alabama. Now I live in Louisiana, so I'm waiting for someone here today to extend an invitation for an extended stay in Florida. So this morning we've kind of explored the vehicle for restoration. We know it's kind of a little bit of a sloppy jalopy, but that's the vehicle that we have. And so our task now as a conservation community, but also as community leaders and business owners and people who rely on the quality of our natural resources, not only for the things we do for fun, but for our very lives, our task is to determine where we want to go and determine how we're going to get there. And so what I'm going to spend the next few minutes focusing on is how do you go from the concept of, a funding mechanism for restoration on a scale that we've never seen in the country's history to actually figuring out what are we going to do, how is it going to contribute to our vision for this place, this Gulf of Mexico ecosystem, and what are the specific steps we need to take to get there. So this is just a really quick reminder. I mean, I think that we've hit this point several times today, and we know it like the back of our hand, but just to remember, way back in 2010, which seems like 25 years ago, the president made a commitment to the Gulf of Mexico region as a national treasure, and he said, it's not just about the oil spill, it's about this place, it's about restoration on a broader scale, it's about bringing this place back to a level of functioning that supports all of the ways we use the Gulf of Mexico. And I think it's important for us to talk about this commitment, talk about this promise, and talk about what it means. It's easy to say, we didn't have any impacts from the oil spill, therefore we can build a convention center. But that's not what this is about. This is about restoring a national treasure that all of us rely on in the country, not just those of us who are lucky to call this region home. So I'm going to back up to the 30,000-foot level for just a couple of minutes, and then we're going to quickly dive back down into some specific thoughts about how do you go about choosing projects, how do you ensure that they're working in concert together to create something that's bigger than the sum of its parts. But I think, as you begin the task of determining, what projects in Florida are really going to move the dial, what's really going to protect the resources that we rely on, it makes sense to kind of think about where is it ultimately we want to go. So, what's the vision for why we're here, why we're doing this, why was there a RESTORE Act in the first place? And so for Ocean Conservancy, and I think for a lot of conservation organizations, we think that restoration of the Gulf ecosystem means sustainable uses. We sustainably use these resources in a way that they're here for us to enjoy, that we're able to recreate and make a living and prop up our economy today, but also for future generations. And so just keeping that in mind as we think about what projects are really going to contribute to our vision for this place. It sounds a little hokey and kumbaya, but it's incredibly important. If we don't know where we want to get to, we're very likely not going to get there. So we kind of think about restoration as a three-legged stool. If you don't focus on all of the elements that support our Gulf ecosystem, that stool is going to fall down and you're going to find yourself in trouble in 5 to 10 years. And this is kind of getting at what Mr. Bill, is that your name? I think he was getting to this point that it's not enough to just look at what happens in a strip of shoreline. We have to really look at restoration from a comprehensive and integrated approach. And it sounds very commonsensical to people who are resource managers or who do this on a daily basis, but it's maybe not as intuitive for some of the folks who are designated by the Restore Act as the decision makers in coming up with these plans. So a focus on coastal restoration, clearly that's important. It's what we all think about, and it's what a lot of members of the public think about when they go back to the summer of 2010 and see, my oiled shoreline. After Hurricane Isaac, we had oiled shoreline again. Clearly, coastal restoration is an important part of this, not just, again, on the NRDA side from impacts, but also wetlands loss and that sort of thing that's critically important. Coastal communities are another element. There are a lot of things that we have to consider when we're looking at restoration in terms of how it can improve the lot of the folks who make the Gulf Coast home. A lot of people found themselves out of work. We know that with time, sea level rise and wetland loss in Louisiana, for instance, our communities become less and less able to recover from disasters, whether natural or man-made or technological. So looking at restoration from the perspective of how it makes our communities stronger and more resilient is also a critical element as we think about restoration across the board. And then, of course, I would be remiss if I didn't talk about marine restoration. We're called the Ocean Conservancy. Blue water restoration is an important piece of this, not just because there's still oil out there in the environment. We're not sure what the full extent, and probably won't be for many years, how it's impacting our marine resources and important habitats, but also because the fisheries that we rely on the commercial side, the reasons people come down here to go fishing and spend all of their money or eat seafood or go out into the marshes and bird watch, there are very clear and critical linkages between what's happening in the estuarine and coastal environments with the marine environment, and we need to address all of those in a comprehensive way, or we're going to be missing important elements of making this ecosystem function as good as it possibly can. So again, kind of drilling down just a little bit from that overarching vision of what it is that we really want to accomplish, either as a management conference or as a state or as a region. We took a look at what are some of the overarching principles that we should use to guide our decision making. And I really appreciate this approach because it saves me a lot of headache at times of, okay, is it pot 2A is, these guys are making the decisions for pot 2A, and pot 1 are these people, and it's these projects and these authorized uses. But if we have agreed on a vision, and if we know where we want to go, and we've established some guiding principles that will help create a roadmap for us, that is applicable across all of the various Restore Act pots of money, and it's applicable for NRDA as well. So the first of those is sound management. How do you actually manage these funds? How do you ensure that there's participation from the public that means something, that sort of thing? And I'll go through these in just a little bit more detail quickly. Stable and coordinated funding. Does it make sense? Even though I think it's probably a physical impossibility somebody may want to try. How do you spend this money down? You can't just write a check and spend all of this money in a year. There's a process, and that needs to be coordinated. How do you pick projects? I mean, at the end of the day, that's what a lot of folks are focused on. What are you actually going to do with this money? How are you going to spend it? And what are you going to have to show for it in 10 or 15 years? Stewardship. How do you manage this process overall? How do you ensure that what we're doing is contributing to what makes this place tick? And then lastly, a sentinel system for the future, and that's a fancy way of saying we need long-term monitoring in science, not just to understand what the baseline conditions in the Gulf of Mexico are and how this ecosystem actually functions, but also to inform our project decision making and to let us know when things are happening and we need to maybe shift course or focus on different projects to address damages that we hadn't really, thought of at this point. You have to have monitoring in place to do that. So just really quickly, sound management means that it's efficient, that it's transparent, that it's responsive to the public. I think that, we talk about the critical importance of public input, and it's important not only on the project selection side, but it's incredibly important that people feel invested in this process and accountable for the success. We didn't get in this pickle magically. It happened because lots and lots of people like to come and live in this place, and it creates challenges. And so involving the public in this process and looking at restoration as a local source of pride is going to be critical to success. We want federal and state partners to commit to incorporating local knowledge and traditional knowledge. There's some Indian tribes that I know here, and as well as in Louisiana, that have a huge stake and a huge base of knowledge that needs to be incorporated into this planning process. And then, of course, there's no substitute for the folks who know these waters best, who know the marshes best. That information should make its way into the comprehensive plan, and there should be a mechanism to do that. I think somebody touched on this earlier. There needs to be coordination between what's happening on the NRDA side with the broader ecosystem restoration, not just to avoid potential duplication, not just to ensure that as a Gulf state we're getting the most bang for our buck, doing what you can with NRDA and then doing the broader ecosystem restoration stuff with the RESTORE Act. But also because there's a lot of the same players, and the science that's being generated as a result of the NRDA process really should help inform and facilitate the projects that we choose to implement on the RESTORE Act side. That mechanism of coordination, I think, is still something that needs to be figured out. One potential nexus that we're looking at right now is connecting through the science. So maybe you have a science advisory panel or a peer review board that is dealing with incorporating information from the NRDA assessments and then feeding that back into the RESTORE Council and the partners, and then vice versa. So that kind of science as a hub for getting at what's happening in NRDA and having that inform broader ecosystem restoration. Comprehensive science-based ecosystem restoration. You will hear me say this over and over again, and I think that it's one of those concepts that everyone agrees on in principle, but it takes money to do science, just like it takes money to build a freshwater diversion or money to do a dune restoration project. And so there needs to be a commitment on the part of decision makers to fund science, to coordinate with other states and federal entities to ensure that there's a coordinated network of monitoring in the long term that will not only help us identify impacts in the long run, but help us shift course, inform our project decision making, and quite frankly, help us to ascertain whether or not the things we're doing are having an impact at all. Stable and coordinated funding, we want predictable funding streams. If we, spend out $5 billion 1 year and then in year 2 have nothing, it's very difficult to plan for that. So there needs to be a mechanism for funding to be consistent over time. I think David touched on this, and this is something that could be critically important, and that is, what's the local buy-in? If you have money that you have in a small grant and you leverage that, against RESTORE Act funding and create something really great, that should be something that gives you higher priority. Any opportunity we can find to use RESTORE Act funding as federal match, we should do that. But this isn't necessarily free money. It's something that is on the scale that we've never seen, and it's okay to ask partners and for all of us to also contribute and have some skin in the game to create something better. And then lastly, coordination of projects supported by various funds. So if, for instance, NEP here has a grant to do some restoration projects, well, how could you maybe incorporate the monitoring that you're doing for that particular project with a dune restoration project or a similar project that Florida DEP is implementing? How can you scale up projects to do things together that you maybe couldn't do alone? That's something that will only make the projects that we implement in the long run better and stronger. All right, so project selection, and this is where we're starting to drill down a little bit deeper into how do you actually think about, how do you go from projects, the universe of projects that everyone and their mother has put together and you know, has waiting at the ready for the minute the check is cut, to actually funding and implementing those that really get you where you want to go, that really have a significant positive environmental impact, that really address causes of degradation. I think it's a critical element for all of these pots of money, and then, but of course, the selection criteria that you ultimately utilize depend on what the potential authorized uses of that particular pot of money are. That was a very inelegant way to say it, but so in terms of just general ideas and thoughts about project selection, there need to be criteria that link projects to specific measurable objectives. It's not enough just to say, I'm going to restore a wetland, you know, the end, or I'm going to build a convention center and call it a day. What is it you're trying to achieve? How are you going to measure that? How are you going to be able to tell the public that you were successful and you achieved what you did, and how it contributes to our vision of a healthy Gulf ecosystem? There needs to be independent peer review. These projects need to be based on science. They need to be monitored, and we need to be accountable for their results. And so one of the ways to do that is to ensure that on the front end, these projects are vetted and reviewed by folks who do this for a living. And that also helps coordinate projects and share resources across states. So if maybe Texas has learned an important lesson that Florida wouldn't want to repeat, figuring out how to share that information and avoid learning hard lessons 5 times over is an important first success. And then lastly, that projects are coordinated and integrated within a comprehensive framework for restoration. And that's just a fancy way of saying that it's not enough just to do coastal restoration, just like it's not enough to only address economic restoration, and it's not enough just to address marine restoration. These projects need to be geographically diverse, and they need to be spread across the ecosystem so that we can really start getting at restoration that connects our processes, you know, upriver, freshwater flow, that sort of thing, with what's happening out in the marine environment in a way that doesn't piecemeal or doesn't just, you know, do a project here and a project there, and at the end of it, you've got some great, you know, little local projects implemented, but you don't really know how it's contributing to your long-term positive impacts. So stewardship, we kind of look at those guiding principles as things that focus on natural resources and ecosystem services that provide also economic opportunity and human uses. There's a project in Alabama that's a great example of that. That did a living shoreline oyster reef project. I think NWF was a partner. It put out-of-work fishermen to work. It had fisheries and shoreline protection values in addition to creating a reef, which was, you know, ostensibly the reason why we were there. And so looking at projects for not just their conservation value, but also how they contribute to economic activities, they put people to work, and how people can utilize and enjoy the benefits of that restoration project should be an important consideration. They should address long-term resiliency and sustainability for coastal communities. I think, you know, everybody here seems to have a pretty firm grasp on what we're trying to accomplish, but, you know, we live in an area of high risk, and one of the reasons we find ourselves at greater risk is that we've lost the protective buffers that used to keep us a little bit safer. So projects that restore some of those natural protective resources and buffers should be considered important and given high priority. And then lastly, and I think this is probably the fourth, we should start a drinking game. Every time I say comprehensive restoration, take a sip of coffee. But I can't actually say it enough, because it's, you know, it's so important. We need to address the entire Gulf ecosystem. We have to go from the coastal and freshwater environments all the way out to the blue water, or we're not gonna get where we want to go. So this last little segment, we've got happy dolphins. I'm going to look at a little bit deeper project selection criteria in general, and this is where things start to get a little bit messy, because I'm going to jump from pot to pot. So just raise your hand and tell me I'm not making any sense, or you're faint with hunger, and I will try to clarify. But looking at how do you go from, so this is the way I think about it. If you're choosing from a universe of projects that's probably very, very large, and everybody has their things that are absolutely critical, that they either dreamed up yesterday or that have been sitting in a plan for the past 25 years just waiting for an opportunity like this to finally get funded, you're going to have really tough decisions to make. And, you know, quite frankly, I wouldn't want to be the person that has to make these decisions, which is why coming up with selection criteria and making their job easier is such a valuable service to these decision makers. And it's not so much, in my opinion, coming up with a way to throw out the clunkers. Hopefully we can, you know, it's usually easy to recognize the things that are just clearly bad, and figure out how to mobilize if you need to and fight those. But it becomes more difficult to figure out from the list of potentially great projects, what are the ones that are A+, super duper, great that you just absolutely have to fund? So how do you kind of get to the yes and fund from the yes? And so that's kind of what we're looking at here. So establishing appropriate criteria and thinking about selection criteria depends on the pot you're looking at. If you're looking at quote unquote pot 1, which is that state equal shares allocation, there are a whole universe of authorized uses that you could argue you could use that funding for. So your criteria for selection would need to be different than the council pot that's looking more specifically at ecosystem restoration. What are your overarching goals? This gets back to your vision and your guiding principles. What is it you really want to accomplish? And it's so funny because we don't tend to go back to that starting point because it seems so elementary. But I think it's really critical to ask yourself with every project, how does this contribute to our vision for this place in 20 or 30 years? And if you can't answer that question, then you either haven't fleshed out the project well enough yet, or it might not be an appropriate project. Are you weeding out the clunkers, or are you looking for the best? Again, this is the filter to get to the best of the best is different than a filter that just throws out the really, not desirable projects. And then lastly, how do you compare apples to oranges? And this is specifically looking at pot 1, which is that, and pot 3. I should probably just stop saying pot. But how do you compare a purely economic restoration project or an infrastructure project with an ecosystem restoration project and come up with criteria that weights one over the other? I mean, how do you actually go about doing that? All right, so we'll start with the easy ones. Ecosystem restoration criteria, looking at, this is I guess looking more specifically at that council restoration pot for which there will be a comprehensive restoration plan. We know that the RESTORE Act and the President's Executive Order instruct the council members to incorporate the strategies and elements of the task force document, which sets out those 4 main overarching goals, and then to develop a list of projects that they will update annually in a 3-year plan. So within those confines, you still have an awful lot of decisions to make about what projects you're going to fund. And so this is just an attempt to look at projects from that ecosystem standpoint to help figure out what projects should rise to the top, either as you're putting a plan together to submit to the Restoration Council at the county or state level, or for the council themselves to prioritize projects. And in an ideal world, those two sets of selection criteria would match, and then you would win, and you'd get all the money for yourself. So priority given to restoration of natural resources and ecosystem services that have economic, cultural, and subsistence value to the people of the Gulf of Mexico. So, and I think that I was talking to Jennifer during the break, I think that we've all become pretty adept at making the environmental restoration is economic restoration argument, but how do you explicitly identify that within the context of a project narrative or a project proposal? Projects that increase the resiliency of communities, that make us stronger and more better able to respond to disasters should be given priority. Projects that address root causes of degradation should be given priority. It's, you know, if we're going to put a Band-Aid every 5 years on an issue and not address the underlying systemic issues, are we really spending this money in the way that it was intended in a way that will really advance our vision? Projects that benefit multiple species or resources. And then lastly, projects that have clear measurable endpoints. We have to determine that, hey, we're really successful. This was a really great project and we should duplicate it over and over again. Or we have to be able to say, ooh, this didn't work. Let's adapt and do it differently and try a different approach so that we don't make the same mistake twice. So that's a quick overview of some potential criteria or priorities for ecosystem restoration. But once you get to, so that we're going to move to the state allocation pot, which is that pot that has all of those bulleted items that Jordan threw up on the screen a little bit earlier, everything from infrastructure to promotion of Gulf seafood consumption to tourism to, of course, ecosystem restoration, which is what we're talking about here. Well, I just really like this picture. It's herding cats. I mean, how do you compare a port infrastructure project with an ecosystem restoration project? So, and I'll just warn you right now, I don't have the answer. But just as food for thought, to wet your whistle for playing in that pot where rightfully we should be conducting ecosystem restoration projects that enhance and preserve our natural resources. One potential way to start looking at that is, again, starting from what is it you want to achieve. So in this particular slide, I kind of divided up the coastal, the Gulf world into three pieces. One, we've got our economy. The other side, we've got our natural resources. And I understand that they are intrinsically linked, but for the sake of argument, follow with me. And then lastly, community resiliency. What are the things that make your citizens stronger? So having a job, for instance, being able to put food on the table, not being washed away every 5 years. What are the specific things that, as a decision maker, you want to achieve for economic restoration or environmental restoration or to make your community more resilient? Establish those parameters first. So maybe on the economic side, you want to stimulate economic activity and you want to create jobs. Okay, so then projects that stimulate economic activity in some form or fashion or that have a large job creation component are ones that you would prioritize. On the environmental side, maybe you draw from those ecosystem criteria. You want projects that address root causes of degradation. You want projects that are at the ecosystem scale. You want projects that are that support the natural resources that your economy relies on, for instance. And then on the community resilience side, same thing. What are the things you want to prioritize and do that will make your community more resilient? And then what you do is you go through the project list and you start thinking about projects and you say, all right, Project X is going to create 17 jobs, and because we're going to have people out, planting marsh grass, and we're going to have a landscape architect design it, and we're going to have an engineering firm, we're going to have a construction firm to do the earth moving and that sort of thing. And it's going to restore habitat for 8 different species, and it's going to create a buffer for a community that, has lost X linear feet of shoreline due to erosion or whatever. Those projects that hit on the economic, the environmental, and the community resiliency, kind of in that sweet spot of that Venn diagram, are the ones that would rise to the top. And so you don't necessarily have to say, well, a port project is better than a marsh restoration project just because it is, or because I say it is, but it's because it meets more of the parameters that you say are important to you as a community or as a state. And that's just one way to look at it. There's a lot of potential ways. One of the ways that I've seen starting to come out in Alabama, actually with your counterparts at the Mobile Bay National Estuary Program, a year or so ago, maybe a little bit more, they did a community assessment to actually determine what it is that people value. And they were going to take that information and use it to inform the rewriting of their CCMP. And what they found is that, people value natural resources, not just the people that live here, but the people that come and visit here as well. They don't come to Florida beaches or Alabama beaches just because we're so nice, although we are, of course, incredibly sweet. But they come here for the resources. And so looking at prioritizing projects and project concepts and priorities from the perspective of what do the citizens value, what's closest to their heart. Is it beaches? Is it fishing? Is it going to eat at the seafood restaurants? Is it bird watching? Is it the water? Figuring out what it is people hold most dear, what is it they would be most invested in protecting, and then establishing your projects based on what people want, what they want more of, or what they want to see repaired is another potential approach. And I believe, it's just a kind of a little bit of a side note, but I think that the goal, at least at the estuary program in Mobile, is to take that management plan and have it be the comprehensive plan that is submitted to the council as the state's plan. Because, lucky for the National Estuary Programs, you already have a lot of buy-in from various stakeholders. You have economic and government and academic and nonprofit entities at the table making decisions in a collaborative fashion. And so you can argue that the projects that you come up with really do, people agree that they hit on all of those important elements that make us function and make this a place that we want to live. So I think there's a lot of potential for existing entities who do a lot of work bringing stakeholders to the table and have for years and years to play a major role in this process, simply because you're ahead of the game in terms of determining what folks value and how you would actually go about developing a plan that contributes to a larger goal. So I'm going to stop chattering, but I'm happy to answer any questions, or you can email me or give me a ring at any time, and I will discuss principles and criteria until you fall on the floor.
So questions for Bethany? You hungry?
No questions. Everybody just wants their ham sandwich.
Okay.
Rosalind Rowe with the Florida Park Service, the District 4, Southwest District. And this may be a no-brainer, but I'm just double-checking. I'm seeing the word restoration projects and solution projects. I'm assuming that money can go to study projects and sort of designating the problem more clearly projects.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
and I mean,
okay.
I think that Ocean Conservancy argues until we're blue in the face that that absolutely has to happen. That's just as important as doing a seagrass restoration project or an oyster reef project. If you don't know what the conditions are, and if you don't know how to measure whether or not you're successful, and that's science, that's monitoring, you're not going to get very far. So, and you absolutely can use these Restore Act funding for monitoring long-term science, that sort of thing. I think it becomes a little bit more dicey on the NRDA side, although we think you can. I think some of the trustees think that you cannot.